the parish church of St. Mary the Virgin had never looked more festive. Garlands of holly and ivy wound around the stone pillars, and the afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, casting jewelled shadows across the worn wooden pews. The village of Thornfield, nestled in the rolling hills of Sussex, had transformed itself into the picture of Christmas propriety. The sort of village that appeared on chocolate boxes and in glossy magazine spreads celebrating the quintessential English holiday. Yet it was precisely this veneer of perfection that caused Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary pew with her knitting needles clicking softly during the final hymn, to feel a slight twinge of unease. Not that anything was visibly amiss. The vicar, Reverend Timothy Ashford, had delivered his sermon with appropriate warmth about goodwill and redemption. The choir, bolstered by London visitors home for the holidays, had sung Handel with respectable precision. The congregation had filed out into the crisp December air, with the satisfied air of people who had fulfilled their Christmas religious obligations, and could now get on with the more important business of eating and drinking. But Miss Marple had lived 83 years, and she had learned that the most dangerous storms often gathered silently, far from obvious notice. The disruption had begun 3 weeks prior, though few in Thornfield would have recognized it as such. Lord Ashworth, who had owned Thornfield Manor for the past 4 decades, had announced that he was hosting a Christmas dinner on December 23rd, not at the manor itself, but at the newly renovated Thornfield House Hotel, which had recently changed hands. The announcement was unusual enough to raise eyebrows. Lord Ashworth was notoriously private, a widower of 10 years who kept largely to himself and his extensive gardens. He entertained rarely, and never with what the village considered to be fuss. The guest list, however, was the real source of speculation. Besides his nephew and heir, Sebastian Ashworth, the dinner would include Dr. and Mrs. Harrogate, the village physician and his wife, Miss Patricia Ashford, the vicar's daughter, Mr. Edmund Trevors, who managed the Ashworth estates, Miss Cordelia Vane, Lord Ashworth's retired companion, and, most intriguingly, Mrs. Sylvia Crane, who had recently taken rooms above the chemist's shop after returning to the village from London following an ambiguous and sudden divorce. It was the inclusion of Mrs. Crane that had set tongues wagging in earnest. Such peculiar taste, Mrs. Pembroke had observed to Miss Marple during a fitting at the village dressmaker's, her sharp eyes glinting over her reading glasses. One would think his lordship might have more discrimination. Miss Marple, who had been having alterations made to her good black dress, had simply smiled and continued threading her needle with yarn for the embroidery work she'd promised for the church bazaar. She had known Sylvia Crane since that young woman was born, a vicar's daughter herself, though from the neighbouring parish. Sylvia had made an imprudent marriage to a charming but ultimately untrustworthy man, and had returned home wounded but not broken. To Miss Marple's eye, Mrs. Crane carried herself with a quiet dignity that suggested inner reserves of strength, but then again strength could take many forms. Miss Marple had observed enough of human nature to know that it could be wielded as easily as a weapon as it could be worn as a shield. The Christmas dinner in question had been scheduled for late evening. An unusual choice, designed, Lord Ashworth had explained, with uncharacteristic chattiness at the village greengrocer's, to allow his guests to attend their various family celebrations first. The dinner would begin at 8 o'clock, with a complete Christmas feast, laid on by the hotel's newly hired chef, a Frenchman of some repute brought down from London to establish the establishment's credentials as a destination of note. On the morning of the dinner, the weather had turned sharp and cold. A low grey sky promised snow, though none had yet fallen. The village of Thornfield had taken on that particular quality of English provincial life in the days before Christmas. A mixture of determined cheerfulness and underlying anxiety, as if everyone was playing a role in a theatrical production they had not quite rehearsed sufficiently. Miss Marple had spent the morning as she spent most mornings, tending to her garden and her correspondence. The garden was largely dormant, of course, but there was always deadheading to be done, dried leaves to clear, the beds to prepare for spring. It was while she was thus occupied, her knees padded against the cold earth, her hands in her aged leather gloves, that young Lucy Bentley, the vicar's housemaid, had appeared at the garden gate with a message. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," the girl had said, breathless from running. "But Dr. Harrogate sent word he needs to speak with you, urgent-like. He's at his surgery, if you can spare the time." This was unusual enough that Miss Marple had straightened, using the garden fork as a crutch, and looked at the girl with interest. Lucy, who was perhaps 22 and prone to excitability, was not the most reliable messenger, but her anxious expression suggested something beyond the ordinary. "Did Dr. Harrogate say what the matter concerned?" Miss Marple had asked. "No, miss. He just said you'd know what it was about, and could you come when you had a moment? Before the evening, he said particularly." Miss Marple had set down her tools, brushed the soil from her skirts, and within the hour had made her way to Dr. Harrogate's neat surgery in the village high street. The doctor was a man in his early 60s, with the kind of careful demeanour that suggested a lifetime of hearing village confidences and keeping them locked behind professional discretion. "Thank you for coming," he had said, closing the surgery door behind her. "I know it's an imposition, and on this of all days." "Not at all," Miss Marple had replied, settling into the comfortable chair across from his desk. "What troubles you, doctor?" Harrogate had been quiet for a long moment, selecting his words with evident care. "It's about this evening," he had finally said. "The dinner at the hotel. I'm troubled by the whole affair, Miss Marple, and I confess I'm not quite sure why. There's something off about it. Strained. Do you know anything that might enlighten me?" Miss Marple had considered this question with the gravity it deserved. What she knew, she had learned through the ordinary channels of village life, conversations overheard, small gestures observed, the subtle semaphore by which human relationships communicated their distress. She knew that Lord Ashworth's health had been declining, though he kept this fact carefully hidden from all but his closest associates. She knew that Sebastian Ashworth, a spoiled and charming young man of 35, had expensive habits and limited means of supporting them. She knew that Edmund Trevors, the estate manager, had recently been making improvements to the Ashworth accounts, improvements that seemed to have coincided with a certain distance between the lord and his heir. She knew that Cordelia Vane had served Lord Ashworth for nearly 30 years, and had never married, and that her devotion had long been the subject of village speculation. She also knew, because she had made it her business to know, that there had been something between Lord Ashworth and Sylvia Crane, something not quite romance, but something warmer than mere friendship, during the weeks since Sylvia's return to Thornfield. But what Miss Marple said to the doctor was simply this: "I think, Dr. Harrogate, that this may be a dinner at which several people are not quite who they appear to be, and that, underneath the Christmas cheer, there may be currents running rather deeper than is comfortable. That, Harrogate had said quietly, is what I feared. Now, as the day had drawn toward evening, and Miss Marple had prepared herself in her good black dress, she had found herself thinking about the nature of secrets. Thornfield was a small village, the sort where everyone knew everyone, or believed they did. And yet, she had learned through 8 decades of attentive observation, the places where people kept their real selves were often the deepest wells, hidden beneath the polite surface of community life. At 7:30, as the snow finally began to fall in soft, fat flakes that melted almost as soon as they touched the ground, Miss Marple had settled herself in the parlour of her small cottage, a cup of hot milk beside her, her knitting needles idle in her lap. She had meant to spend a quiet evening by the fire, but something, a restlessness perhaps, or an instinct honed by decades of careful observation, had kept her from this intention. Instead, she had found herself thinking about empty chairs, about the spaces in our lives that we fill with our assumptions, about the way that absence, like presence, could speak volumes if one knew how to listen. It was at 7:45, just as she was considering whether to add a log to the fire, that the telephone had rung. The voice on the other end was Mrs. Crane's, and it was tight with something between distress and control. "Miss Marple, I'm terribly sorry to disturb you. I'm at the hotel and I wondered if I might ask you something in the strictest confidence." "Of course," Miss Marple had said, her mind already beginning to organize the possibilities. "What is it, dear?" "It's about this evening, about Lord Ashworth's dinner. I received a note, you see, just an hour ago. It's rather disturbing, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it, or whether I should mention it to anyone. And I thought perhaps you might understand." "What did the note say?" Miss Marple had asked, and she could hear the steadiness in her own voice, though her heart had begun to beat with a slightly quickened rhythm. There had been a pause on the other end of the line. When Mrs. Crane's voice came again, it was barely above a whisper. It said, "Do not come tonight. If you love your life, stay away from Thornfield House. A warning from a friend." "And you have no idea who sent it?" "None whatsoever. Miss Marple, I'm frightened. The handwriting is unfamiliar to me, and I can't help thinking, what if something is going to happen this evening? What if one of us is in danger?" Miss Marple had taken a moment to gather her thoughts. In that moment, she had seen, with the clarity that only came from years of attention, the shape of what was to come. Not the particulars, those would reveal themselves in due course, but the shape nonetheless. A dinner, a gathering, a warning, and, somewhere beneath it all, the cold reality that most human wickedness stemmed not from impulse, but from careful planning. "Mrs. Crane," she had said slowly, "I think you should go to the dinner. I think you should go and observe carefully. And afterward, I think you should speak with the constable. In the meantime, I am going to make a telephone call of my own." "You don't think I'm being foolish?" "Not at all. I think you're being brave. There's a difference." After Mrs. Crane had rung off, Miss Marple had sat for a long moment, the telephone receiver still in her hand. Then, with the careful deliberation that had characterized her entire life, she had begun to compose a list of names in her mind. Lord Ashworth, Sebastian Ashworth, Dr. and Mrs. Harrogate, Miss Patricia Ashford, Edmund Trevors, Cordelia Vane, Sylvia Crane, 7 people gathering for Christmas dinner, and Miss Marple with the certainty that came from a lifetime of observation, was absolutely certain that before the evening was through, something would happen that would change Thornfield forever. She had pulled on her thick wool coat, her sturdy shoes, and her sensible hat. She had written a note to her housekeeping woman, Mrs. Cherry, explaining that she had been called out to an unexpected matter and would return late. And at 8:05, she had made her way through the falling snow toward Thornfield House Hotel, her walking stick tapping steadily against the frozen ground, her mind already working through the possibilities with the precision of a master craftsperson counting stitches. Whatever was to happen tonight, Miss Marple intended to see it clearly. The snow was falling more heavily now, muffling sound, obscuring the familiar landscape. The world had become smaller, more intimate, more dangerous. At the hotel, lights blazed in the windows, creating islands of warmth against the December darkness. And somewhere inside those windows, 7 people were about to sit down to a Christmas dinner that would be interrupted by something far less festive than any of them, except perhaps one, expected. Miss Marple paused for just a moment on the steps of the hotel, looking up at those bright windows, and allowed herself the smallest of sighs. In her experience, it was always at the most cheerful gatherings that the darkest secrets emerged. Christmas, with all its insistence on goodwill and forgiveness, was perhaps the cruelest time of all for those carrying unbearable burdens. She pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped inside. The Thornfield House Hotel's dining room was a study in festive excess. The newly installed chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the long mahogany table, which had been draped with an Italian tablecloth of cream and gold. Holly sprays and white candles had been arranged at intervals, and each place setting gleamed with the promise of the meal to come. The hotel's proprietor, a thin, nervous man named Whitmore, who had purchased the Arjun establishment only 6 months prior, hovered near the kitchen door, with the anxious demeanor of someone acutely aware that his entire enterprise depended upon this evening's success. Lord Ashworth stood by the fireplace, a glass of sherry in his weathered hand, examining his assembled guests with an expression that could best be described as imperious neutrality. He was a man of 78, tall and still commanding, despite the slight stoop that age had begun to impose upon his spine. His face was lined like an old map, each crease marking some past journey through the complexities of aristocratic life. His eyes, however, remained sharp and intelligent, grey-blue and faintly amused, as if he alone possessed some essential joke about the gathering before him. Sebastian Ashworth stood somewhat apart, examining the wine list with the concentration of a man whose knowledge of claret outweighed his knowledge of most other subjects. He was handsome in the manner of men who had never had to depend upon anything but their appearance, with dark hair, regular features, and an easy confidence that seemed to cost him nothing. His dinner jacket was impeccably tailored, his cufflinks solid gold. To the casual observer, he was the picture of a well-bred gentleman awaiting a pleasant evening. But Miss Marple, who had slipped into the hotel without drawing particular attention to herself, noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed slightly against the table, the beads of perspiration on his temple, despite the cool temperature of the room. Dr. Harrogate and his wife Margaret were engaged in the social amenities, discussing with Miss Patricia Ashford the latest improvements to the vicar's garden. Margaret Harrogate was a plump, cheerful woman of 60, with the sort of genuine kindness that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a stove. Patricia, the vicar's daughter, was a woman of 35, unmarried and likely to remain so, with the slightly faded prettiness of someone who had missed her opportunities and had learned to bear the disappointment with grace. She worked as a schoolmistress and was known for her patience with the village children. Edmund Trevors, the estate manager, stood examining a landscape painting on the wall with the appreciation of a man who knew the value of things. He was perhaps 50, with the weathered face of someone who spent considerable time out of doors, and the careful posture of a man who was always acutely aware of his position in the social hierarchy. His wife had died some years ago, and he had devoted himself entirely to the management of the Ashworth estates, a devotion that seemed to have become almost obsessive in recent months. Cordelia Vane sat at the far end of the room, near the window, knitting with steady practiced movements. She was a woman of 65, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a tight bun, and the kind of severe beauty that suggested a life lived according to principle, rather than pleasure. Her black dress was of excellent quality, but several years out of fashion. Cordelia, it was understood, neither had nor desired the means for fashionable dress. She had been Lord Ashworth's companion for nearly 30 years, had run his household, managed his correspondence, and been the steady, competent presence at his side through widowhood and advancing age. In the village, she was known as a woman of absolute discretion and unquestionable loyalty. And then there was Sylvia Crane. She sat at the opposite end of the table from Cordelia, her pale blue dress creating a striking contrast with her dark hair. Sylvia was a woman of 42, though she had the kind of timeless quality that made age somewhat irrelevant. She had been a renowned beauty in her youth, and though the passage of time had softened her features rather than hardened them, there remained an elegance about her that seemed almost fragile, as if it might shatter at the wrong touch. Her eyes were intelligent and sad. The eyes of a woman who had loved unwisely and paid a considerable price. Miss Marple, who had arrived just as the guests were assembling and had taken a position near the kitchen entrance on the pretext of admiring a painting, observed all of this with the keen attention of a naturalist watching the complicated behavior of a fascinating species. "Madame, mademoiselle, monsieur," a heavily accented voice announced, "dinner is served." The chef had appeared at the kitchen door, a stout man of perhaps 60, with a magnificent moustache, and the imperious manner of one who regarded cooking as a sacred art. "We begin with the bisque de homard," he continued, "followed by the consommé, the fish course, a delightful sole amandine, and then the piece de résistance, a magnificent roast beef with all accompaniments." Lord Ashworth rose, gesturing his guests toward the table. "Come, come, no need to stand on ceremony. This is after all meant to be a relaxed occasion." It was, Miss Marple reflected, the first indication of the evening that Lord Ashworth was capable of irony. The guests took their places with the careful choreography of people familiar with such conventions. Lord Ashworth sat at the head of the table, with Sebastian to his right and Dr. Harrogate to his left. Margaret Harrogate was placed next to her husband, Patricia Ashford beside Sebastian. Edmund Trevors sat across from Patricia, and Cordelia Vane at the opposite end of the table from Lord Ashworth. Sylvia Crane was positioned between Edmund Trevors and Dr. Harrogate, a deliberate arrangement, Miss Marple noted, that placed her neither at the head of the table nor at the foot, but rather in the middle, equidistant from multiple points of tension. The soup course was served in silence, broken only by the gentle clink of spoons against china and the occasional murmur of polite appreciation. It was during this course that Miss Marple, from her vantage point, began to observe the particular dynamics of the gathering. Sebastian Ashworth, she noted, did not once look at his uncle. He ate with the mechanical precision of someone whose mind was elsewhere, and his free hand, the one not occupied with soup spoon or wine-glass, remained clenched in his lap. When he did speak, addressing Patricia Ashford with a comment about the hotel's new decor, his voice carried an edge of forced lightness. Edmund Trevors, meanwhile, spoke with careful courtesy to Sylvia Crane, asking about her adjustment to village life after her time in London. Sylvia answered with grace and composure, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on her spoon when Edmund mentioned that Lord Ashworth had mentioned her return to the village with particular pleasure. Cordelia Vane, at her end of the table, said almost nothing, eating with the methodical precision of a woman whose appetite had long since departed from anything resembling pleasure. But her eyes, grey and cold, moved frequently toward Sylvia Crane, and the expression in them was not kind. It was Margaret Harrogate, that warm and genuine woman, who attempted to fill the conversational void. She spoke about the church bazaar, about the upcoming Christmas festivities, about the new improvements to the school. Her voice was bright and insistent, as if she were determined to generate enough cheerfulness for the entire table through sheer force of will. "How lovely," she said to Patricia, "that you've been helping with the children's pageant. They were absolutely darling last year." "Thank you," Patricia replied, "though I confess the children this year are somewhat more spirited than last year's group. One of the boys insisted on adding a donkey to the nativity scene. I finally had to allow it, just to keep the peace." This small story seemed to ease the tension slightly, and by the time the soup course was cleared and the fish course arrived, the conversation had begun to flow with slightly more ease. Dr. Harrogate spoke about the unusual mildness of the autumn, and Lord Ashworth mentioned a new variety of roses he had been cultivating in the manor's greenhouses. But Miss Marple, observing from her position near the kitchen, noticed that the ease was entirely superficial. Beneath the pleasant words there remained a current of profound unease. It was when the fish course had been cleared, and the servants were preparing to bring in the roast beef, that something shifted in the atmosphere. Lord Ashworth set down his wineglass with deliberate care, and looked directly at his nephew. "Sebastian," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to the entire table, "I have been meaning to speak with you all evening, about certain matters relating to the estate." Sebastian's fork stopped midway to his mouth. He set it down carefully on his plate. When he spoke, his voice was light, almost defiant. "Can't it wait until after dinner, Uncle? I hardly think the middle of a meal is the appropriate time for business discussions." "On the contrary," Lord Ashworth replied, "I think it is precisely the appropriate time, given that the matter concerns everyone at this table." At this pronouncement, the room became very quiet indeed. The servants had paused in their preparations, and even the chef's assistant appeared to sense that something of importance was occurring. From her place near the kitchen door, Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her attention focused entirely on the unfolding scene. "What Uncle means to say," Sebastian began, attempting to recover his composure, "is that I have been reviewing the accounts," Lord Ashworth interrupted, his voice taking on a harder edge. "The accounts which Edmund has been so assiduously managing on my behalf. I have noticed certain irregularities, certain transfers of funds that do not align with my own authorization, certain expenditures that appear designed to benefit my nephew's personal enterprises rather than the estate itself. There was a sound from Edmund Trevors, not quite a gasp, but a sharp intake of breath. Cordelia Vane's knitting needles had stilled in her lap. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sebastian said, but his voice had lost its easy confidence. "If there have been irregularities, they're hardly my concern. That's Edmund's responsibility." "Oh, but they are your concern," Lord Ashworth said, leaning back in his chair and regarding his nephew with an expression of cold disappointment. "Because these irregularities, as I have termed them, involve the promised settlement of your recent debts. Debts incurred at gaming establishments in London. Debts, I might add, that Edmund appears to have been paying on your behalf without my knowledge or explicit authorization." The silence that followed this announcement was absolute. The very air in the dining room seemed to have gone still. It was Sylvia who spoke first, her voice soft but steady. "Lord Ashworth, surely these are matters that might be discussed in private rather than in front of whom?" Lord Ashworth turned his gaze upon her, and it was not a kind gaze. "In front of my physicians, in front of my estate manager, in front of my oldest and most loyal companion. These are precisely the people who should know the truth, Mrs. Crane. The truth about the Ashworth finances. The truth about my nephew's character. The truth about the future of this estate." "What is it you're implying?" Patricia Ashford asked, her voice uncertain. She seemed to sense, as they all did, that they had entered territory that was both dangerous and irreversible. "I am not implying anything," Lord Ashworth said flatly. "I am stating quite clearly that I have discovered evidence of systematic misappropriation of my funds. And I am saying further that I have made a decision regarding my will." At this, Sebastian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't be serious. You can't possibly." "I can be, and I am," Lord Ashworth replied. "I am changing my will. The estate shall not pass to you, Sebastian. It shall pass instead to more worthy hands." "What?" Sebastian's face had gone pale, then flooded with colour. "You're cutting me off? After everything? After—" "You're damned right I'm cutting you off," Lord Ashworth said, and there was something almost cruel in his satisfaction. "And I will ensure that the world knows exactly why." It was at this precise moment, as the family drama reached its crescendo, that there came a sound from above the dining room. A sound like a heavy object falling. A dull thud that seemed to shake the very structure of the hotel. The servants froze. Margaret Harrogate's hand went to her mouth. Edmund Trevors had risen partway out of his chair. "What on earth?" Dr. Harrogate began. And then, above them, there came a sound that would echo through Thornfield for months to come. A scream. Long, piercing, utterly devoid of restraint. It was Cordelia Vane who moved first. She set down her knitting needles with methodical precision and rose from her chair with a dignity that seemed almost preternatural. "There is someone in distress," she said flatly. "In one of the upstairs rooms, I should imagine." "The kitchen," someone said. It might have been Edmund, or perhaps Dr. Harrogate. But it was Patricia who moved toward the door, her schoolmistress's instinct overriding propriety. "We should go. We should see what's—" The scream came again, this time slightly more muffled, as if the person emitting it had realized they should. Miss Marple, from her place near the kitchen, had already begun moving toward the stairs that led to the upper floors of the hotel. Her sensible shoes made no sound on the carpeted corridor. Behind her, she could hear Lord Ashworth's voice, still composed despite the chaos. "Mr. Whitmore, what rooms are occupied above this floor?" The hotel proprietor's response was lost in the general confusion as guests and servants began moving toward the stairs. But Miss Marple was already climbing them, her mind working through the possibilities with mathematical precision. A scream from upstairs. At the precise moment when family secrets were being revealed and futures were being unmade. It was, she reflected, a rather theatrical touch. The second-floor corridor was dimly lit, illuminated only by a single wall sconce. 3 doors lined the hallway, all of them closed. From behind one, the third door on the left, there came a sound of movement, of something being hastily rearranged. Miss Marple paused for just a moment, her hand on her walking stick, considering the geography of the situation. Then, with the deliberation of someone who had spent 83 years observing human nature in all its manifestations, she moved toward the third door and knocked. There was a moment of complete silence. Then the door opened, and Miss Marple found herself face to face with something that would very shortly turn Thornfield's world upside down. The room behind the third door was empty of occupants, though not of evidence of recent habitation. The bed had been unmade in haste, pillows scattered across the floor. A window was open to the cold December air, frost forming on the sill. On the small desk, a cup of tea sat cooling. A book lay open and face down, as if hastily abandoned. And on the floor, partially hidden beneath the bed's velvet skirt, lay a woman's shoe. It was a delicate thing, made of fine leather, with a small heel and an ornamental buckle. Miss Marple recognized it immediately as belonging to someone of refined taste and considerable means. She was examining it with interest when the sound of footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of the others. Dr. Harrogate appeared first, his medical bag clutched in his hand. Behind him came Edmund Trevors, breathing heavily, and then Patricia Ashford, her face flushed with exertion and distress. "There's no one here," Patricia said immediately, her eyes taking in the details of the room. "But someone was, recently. The window," Edmund pointed to the open casement. "Someone's gone out that way." Dr. Harrogate moved immediately to the window and peered down. "There's a ledge," he said, and then a drop to the kitchen garden below, perhaps 15 feet. A person might survive such a fall, but they would likely be injured. It was at this moment that Lord Ashworth appeared in the doorway, with Sylvia Crane close behind him, and Cordelia Vane bringing up the rear with a candle held before her like a talisman. "What has occurred?" Lord Ashworth demanded, his voice sharp despite the shock evident in his eyes. "Who screamed?" "We don't know, Uncle," Edmund replied. "The room appears to have been occupied, but whoever was here has fled. Out the window, it seems." "My God," Lord Ashworth breathed, moving to the window and looking down into the snowy darkness below. "Who rented this room?" "Whitmore. Where the devil is Whitmore?" The hotel proprietor appeared moments later, ascending the stairs with an expression of profound distress. "My lord," he said, wringing his hands, "I can assure you that the room was rented to a gentleman, a Mr. Harold Fitzwilliam, who arrived yesterday and paid in advance for 3 nights. He claimed to be a businessman from London seeking refuge from the city bustle. I have no knowledge of Fitzwilliam." Lord Ashworth's face had gone a peculiar shade of grey. "Describe this gentleman to me." "Well, he was of middle years, my lord, perhaps 45 or 50, with dark hair beginning to grey at the temples. He was quite pleasant in manner, though he kept largely to his room. I only saw him briefly at check-in." The room had become very silent. Miss Marple, who had entered quietly behind the others, observed the reaction to this description with great care. It was Sylvia Crane whose reaction was most telling. Her hand had gone to her throat, and her face had become very pale indeed. And Cordelia Vane, that cold and composed woman, had allowed her candle to drop slightly, its light wavering. "Where is the register?" Lord Ashworth demanded. "Where is the record of this man's name?" "Downstairs in the office, my lord," Whitmore replied. "Shall I?" "Go," Lord Ashworth ordered. "Fetch it at once." Within minutes the hotel's registration book had been produced. Lord Ashworth turned to the entry for the previous day, with movements that suggested barely controlled fury. He studied the signature for a long moment, then his hand clenched, crumpling the edge of the book. "It's a false name," he said finally, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "Of course it is. How do you know that, Uncle?" Sebastian had appeared in the doorway, having followed the group upstairs. "Because," Lord Ashworth replied, not taking his eyes from the register, "there is no such person as Harold Fitzwilliam. The name is entirely fictitious. It was, in fact, the name given by a man I knew many years ago. A man I believed to be long dead." "Good heavens," Patricia breathed. "You don't mean—" "I mean exactly what I say," Lord Ashworth interrupted. "I mean that someone is playing games with me. Someone is attempting to unsettle me by assuming a name from my past. The question is why, and more importantly, who?" It was at this point that Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. The sound was small and unobtrusive, but it seemed to cut through the confusion like a bell. "My dear Lord Ashworth," she said, "might I make an observation?" All eyes turned toward her. It was Dr. Harrogate who seemed least surprised by her presence, though a flicker of something, perhaps irritation, crossed his face. "Miss Marple," Lord Ashworth said, recognition and something that might have been relief crossing his features. "How is it that you come to be here? This is hardly a matter for a village busybody." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Perhaps not. And yet, I find that I have made something of a study of human nature over the years, and observation has often proved more useful than official protocols in matters of this sort. If I might be permitted." Lord Ashworth gestured for her to continue. "The scream we heard," Miss Marple said slowly, "came from this room, and yet no one is here. The window is open, and there is a shoe beneath the bed. A woman's shoe, I should say, of considerable quality. The bed has been disturbed recently, and there is a cup of tea still warm to the touch. Someone was here very recently. Someone who left in considerable haste. And yet," she paused, her pale blue eyes moving from face to face, observing their reactions. "And yet," she continued, "the scream seemed directed at creating disturbance, at drawing attention. I wonder, Lord Ashworth, whether the scream and the flight from the window were intended to divert us from something else. Something that occurred downstairs, in the dining room, just moments before." There was a long silence. It was Cordelia Vane who finally spoke, her voice cold and precise. "You are suggesting that the disturbance upstairs was orchestrated to divert attention from events below. Why would that be necessary?" "Because," Miss Marple replied, "something of great significance was about to be revealed. Something that mattered enough to risk drawing suspicion through elaborate theatrical display. That requires motive. And motive, I find, is usually personal rather than random." Lord Ashworth had sunk into the small chair near the desk, looking suddenly his age in a way that suggested the facade of control he had maintained throughout the evening had cracked substantially. We need to examine this room more carefully, Dr. Harrogate said, his physician's pragmatism asserting itself over the melodrama of the moment. We need to see if there's any indication of who was actually here, and we need to check below to see if someone did indeed fall from that window. I'll go, Edmund Trevors said immediately. I'll check the garden. I'll accompany you, Sebastian offered, and there was something almost eager in his voice, as if he were grateful for the opportunity to escape the room and its implications. As the two men departed, Lord Ashworth rose slowly from the chair and looked directly at Sylvia Crane. "Well," he said quietly, "do you have anything you wish to tell us?" Sylvia's face had gone very white. She appeared to be struggling with some internal battle, her hands twisting together in evident distress. "I don't know what you mean," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "I think you do," Lord Ashworth replied. "I think you know precisely what I mean, and I think you know who was in this room." "Lord Ashworth," Patricia intervened, her schoolmistress's sense of fairness overriding social convention. "Surely you can't simply accuse Mrs. Crane of—" "I can, and I do," Lord Ashworth said coldly. "Because I suspect that the man who signed the register as Harold Fitzwilliam is not a stranger to Mrs. Crane. In fact, I suspect he is her husband." The reaction to this statement was immediate and profound. Margaret Harrogate gasped. Patricia's face showed shock and confusion. Cordelia Vane's expression, by contrast, remained coldly unsurprised, as if she had suspected this all along. "That's absurd," Sylvia said, but her voice trembled. "My husband is in America. I divorced him more than a year ago. He has no reason to—" "To what?" Lord Ashworth demanded. "To return to Thornfield, to check on his ex-wife? To engineer a theatrical disturbance designed to draw attention away from important revelations? Or perhaps, and this is the most interesting possibility, to become involved in some scheme that involves blackmail?" "Blackmail?" Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Yes, that would explain a great deal." Everyone turned to look at her. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had just worked through a particularly intricate knitting pattern. "What we have here is someone, presumably Mrs. Crane's ex-husband, who has taken considerable trouble to return to Thornfield, to register at the hotel under an assumed name, and to be present during what he must have known would be an important family gathering. The scream, the dramatic flight from the window, these are calculated to create distraction and confusion. They suggest that someone wishes to prevent something from becoming known." "But what?" Patricia asked. "What could be so important that it would require—" It was at this moment that there came a sound from downstairs. A shout, Sebastian's voice, high and urgent. "Dr. Harrogate, come quickly!" The doctor was already moving toward the stairs. Miss Marple, with surprising agility for a woman of her years, was close behind him. The others followed, and soon the entire party was descending, rapidly toward the ground floor. In the hotel's kitchen garden, illuminated by the light from the kitchen windows and the snow that was falling thick and fast now, they found Edmund Trevors kneeling beside a huddled figure. It was a man, clad in evening dress, his face turned to the side, one arm at an awkward angle that suggested a break. "Is he alive?" Dr. Harrogate asked, dropping to his knees beside the prone figure. "Just barely," Edmund replied. "I found him here, half buried in the snow. He must have fallen from the window." The man's eyes flickered open. He looked up at the assembled group, and though his face was battered and bleeding, there was a clarity in his gaze that suggested consciousness returning despite the pain. It was Sylvia who made the identification, her voice breaking as she spoke. "David," she whispered. "Oh my God, David!" The man's lips moved, and though his voice was barely audible, the words seemed to carry across the cold night air with terrible clarity. "Stay away from him, Sylvia," he gasped. Don't trust what he's told you. I came back to warn you. The man upstairs, he's not who you think." His voice trailed off, his eyes closing. But it was enough. Miss Marple stood in the snow, watching the scene unfold, her mind working through the layers of deception with practiced ease. The question was no longer who had screamed in the upstairs room or who had fallen from the window. The question was far more fundamental. Who was lying to whom, and about what? And as she looked around at the faces of the assembled group, at Sebastian's shock, at Edmund's careful neutrality, at Cordelia's cold satisfaction, at Sylvia's obvious despair, she realized that the evening's events had been merely the opening moves in a much more complex game. The game, Miss Marple understood, was just beginning. The doctor's surgery had been converted, for the evening's purposes, into a makeshift hospital room. David Crane, for it was indeed Sylvia's estranged husband, lay on the examination table with his left arm in a temporary splint and his right leg elevated on pillows. Dr. Harrogate, assisted by Margaret and Patricia, had cleaned and bandaged his wounds with professional efficiency. The break in his arm was a clean one, the doctor had pronounced, and while his ribs were likely bruised and possibly fractured, there was no evidence of internal bleeding. He would recover, though slowly and with considerable discomfort. The conversation, however, was proceeding far less smoothly than his physical recovery. "I don't understand," Lord Ashworth said, standing near the fireplace of the surgery's reception room with a glass of brandy in his hand, the third by Miss Marple's count, "why you felt it necessary to return to Thornfield, Mr. Crane, or why you felt compelled to do so under an assumed identity." They had retired to the reception area, leaving David Crane in the inner room under Margaret's watchful eye. The party consisted now of Lord Ashworth, Sebastian, Edmund Trevors, Sylvia, Cordelia, and, at Lord Ashworth's express invitation, Miss Marple. The invitation had surprised no one. By this point, it was obvious that Miss Marple had become, whether intentionally or not, something like an unofficial investigator into the events of the evening. David Crane's response came from the inner room, audible through the open door. "Because," he called out, his voice weak but determined, "Sylvia needed to know the truth about Ashworth, and because I knew she wouldn't listen to me if I simply wrote a letter." "The truth about me?" Lord Ashworth turned sharply. "And what truth is that, precisely? That I have employed myself in attempting to, what, seduce your ex-wife? Extort money from her? What exactly is the truth you feel compelled to deliver?" "That you're not what you pretend to be," David Crane replied. "That you've been lying about your circumstances, your health, your intentions, and that your nephew, your supposedly beloved nephew, is far more complicit in those lies than anyone realizes." There was a sharp sound from Sebastian, something between a laugh and a snort of derision. "This is absurd," he said, addressing the room at large. "This man is a confessed liar. He's registered under a false name, burst into the hotel in the middle of the night, and apparently engineered some sort of theatrical disturbance. And now we're supposed to believe his accusations against me? Against Lord Ashworth?" "I didn't engineer anything." David Crane's voice carried a note of genuine distress. "I never screamed, and I certainly didn't intend to throw myself out of a window. Someone else was in that room with me. Someone who arrived just after I'd gotten settled. We argued, I was struck, and then there was a struggle, a woman's scream, and I fell. Who was in the room with you? Edmund Trevors asked, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone attempting to organize chaotic information. I couldn't see her face clearly. It was dark and I was already half-dazed from the blow, but I felt her. She was small, strong, and she moved with a purpose. She wasn't there by accident. Miss Marple, who had been listening to this exchange with the attention of someone sorting through a complex embroidery pattern, finally spoke. "It seems to me," she said gently, "that we are making an assumption. We are assuming that the disturbance upstairs was related to the revelations that were occurring downstairs. But what if, in fact, they were entirely separate events that simply coincided in time?" "How could they be unrelated?" Patricia asked. "The timing is too convenient. The man arrives, there's a disturbance, the family secrets are about to be revealed. It's all connected." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. "But consider also the alternative. What if someone downstairs created the disturbance upstairs? What if someone sent word to an accomplice, or orchestrated matters such that another person would be present in that room at precisely the moment the family confrontation was reaching its crescendo?" There was a thoughtful silence. It was Cordelia who broke it, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You're suggesting that one of us arranged this disturbance? That one of us had knowledge of David Crane's presence and directed him to the hotel?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple said, "but I am suggesting that the disturbance served a purpose. It drew everyone away from the dining room at a critical moment. It prevented Lord Ashworth from making, or completing, the announcements he seemed intent upon making. It gave certain people time to think, to plan, perhaps to conceal something they wished concealed." "This is madness," Sebastian said flatly. "We're inventing conspiracies out of thin air." But Miss Marple noticed that despite his words of dismissal, Sebastian's hand had tightened on his wine glass, and more significantly, she noticed that Edmund Trevors had gone very pale, his careful composure slipping for just a moment to reveal something underneath, something that looked very much like fear. "Perhaps we should ask Mr. Crane more direct questions," Miss Marple suggested. "The answers, after all, are likely to be less speculative than our current theories." "Such as?" Lord Ashworth asked, moving toward the door to the inner room. "Such as, what were you doing in the room when this alleged accomplice arrived? Were you waiting for someone? And most importantly, what precisely did you wish to warn Mrs. Crane about?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Then David Crane's voice, audible through the open door, answered, "I wanted to warn her that Lord Ashworth is not a wealthy man. I wanted her to know that what he represents, what he's been presenting himself as, is a kind of elaborate fiction. I came back because Sylvia was about to make a terrible mistake." "What sort of mistake?" Sylvia asked, her voice small and frightened. "I've been in London," David continued, "and I made certain investigations. I discovered that Ashworth has been living on the edge of financial ruin for years. His estates are heavily mortgaged. His health is failing. He has perhaps 2 years left to live, maybe less." "How could you possibly know that?" Lord Ashworth demanded, but there was no force in his objection. "Because I hired a private investigator," David said simply. "It wasn't difficult. Your banking arrangements are less secretive than you imagine. I discovered that you've been selling off family property, quietly, without acknowledging it publicly. I discovered that you've been borrowing heavily against the future of the estate. and I discovered something else that seemed particularly relevant to Sylvia's situation. What? Sylvia's voice was urgent now, almost desperate. That you've been cultivating her company with a specific purpose in mind. That you've been considering making a will that leaves her a substantial portion of your estate. Perhaps even, at some point, considering marriage. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Miss Marple observed the reactions with careful attention. Sylvia's face had gone very pale, but it was not, she noticed, with surprise. Rather, it was with confirmation of something she had already suspected. Sebastian had gone stiff with shock. Edmund Trevors had actually sat down heavily in the nearest chair, and Cordelia Vane's expression had transformed into something cold and dangerous, and utterly devoid of any remaining pretense at composure. "How dare you?" Cordelia said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "How dare you come here and make such accusations?" "They're not accusations," David replied. "They're observations, and they would be irrelevant except for one crucial fact." "Which is?" Lord Ashworth asked, and for the first time his voice carried genuine uncertainty. "That Sylvia doesn't know that Ashworth has already written the will you mention. That she's to be his primary beneficiary, along with a substantial cash bequest." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Sylvia actually swayed on her feet, and it was only Edmund Trevors's swift action in offering her a chair that prevented her from falling. "Is this true?" Patricia asked, turning to Lord Ashworth. "Have you actually written a will?" "That is an entirely private matter," Lord Ashworth interrupted, his voice returning some of its normal authority. "What I choose to do with my property is my concern, and no one else's." "It becomes everyone's concern," Sebastian said, and now his voice carried a tone of something bordering on desperation. "When it affects the family fortune, when it involves giving money to a stranger, Mrs. Crane is hardly a stranger," Edmund said quietly. "The entire village knows her. The entire village knows her because she has a title, and history in the area," Sebastian spat. "Not because she deserves Lord Ashworth's generosity." It was at this point that Miss Marple made an observation, delivered in her gentle but relentless way. "What strikes me as interesting," she said, "is the particular order of revelations this evening. First, we have the confrontation about your financial mismanagement, Mr. Sebastian. Then we have the disturbance upstairs. Then we have Mr. David Crane's appearance with his accusations about Lord Ashworth's finances. And now we have the revelation of the will." "What is your point?" Edmund asked, though his tone suggested he already understood. "My point," Miss Marple said, "is that the order is revealing. It suggests that someone wished certain facts to come to light in a particular sequence. Someone who understood that each revelation would prepare the ground for the next. Someone who orchestrated matters such that we would reach this moment, when Lord Ashworth's mortality, his financial troubles, and his intentions toward Mrs. Crane would all be simultaneously known." "But who would do that?" Patricia asked. "Why would anyone?" "Because," Miss Marple said quietly, turning her gaze to the corner of the room where Cordelia Vane sat rigid with suppressed emotion, "there is someone in this room for whom these revelations represent something far more significant than they do for the rest of us." Cordelia's face had gone completely white. She rose from her chair with surprising violence, her knitting needles clattering to the floor. "You know nothing," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "Nothing about loyalty, nothing about sacrifice, Nothing about what it means to spend 30 years of your life in service to someone only to have that service cast aside when a pretty face appears. Cordelia. Lord Ashworth's voice carried a note of warning, but it was too late. Do you think I didn't know? Cordelia continued, her words pouring out like poison. Do you think I didn't see what was happening? The way you looked at her, the way you sought her company, the way you began to speak of futures and new beginnings, after 30 years, after everything I gave up for you. You never gave up anything you didn't want to give up, Lord Ashworth said, his voice hardening. You chose to remain in my service, Cordelia. You chose it freely. I chose it because I loved you. Cordelia's voice had risen to nearly a shout. I chose it because I thought eventually you would understand, that you would see what was right in front of you. But you never did. You never saw me. Not really. Not until she came back to the village. Cordelia, Lord Ashworth said more gently, what you're feeling is understandable, but it is not my responsibility. It should have been. Cordelia turned away, her hands shaking. I should have mattered. My devotion should have meant something. The room had gone very quiet. Everyone was looking at Cordelia with the dawning realization that they had been witnessing the unfolding of a tragedy far older and deeper than the events of the evening itself. It was Miss Marple who broke the silence, her voice kind but inexorable. You sent the warning note to Mrs. Crane, Miss Marple said. The note that told her to stay away from the hotel. Cordelia did not deny it. She simply stared out the window into the snow-filled darkness. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. But that was not all, Miss Marple continued. The disturbance upstairs, that was not Cordelia's work, I think. That required someone else. Someone who had their own reasons for wishing to create chaos. And I believe I know who that person is. All eyes turned to her. Even Cordelia seemed to have emerged from her emotional fugue enough to be curious. The question, Miss Marple said, is why would someone orchestrate a confrontation between Mr. Crane and an unknown woman in that hotel room? Why would they time it to coincide with the family gathering downstairs? The answer, I think, lies not in love or in betrayal, but in something far more primal. It lies in survival. She turned her gaze to Edmund Trevors, and as she did, she saw something in his face shift, a recognition that she had seen through his careful facade. You, she said quietly, have far more to lose from tonight's revelations than anyone else in this room. You, Mr. Trevors, are not merely an employee of Lord Ashworth's. You are, I suspect, something far more complicated. Edmund Trevors did not attempt to deny what Miss Marple had surmised. Instead, he rose slowly from his chair, and for a moment, the careful mask that had defined him throughout the evening fell away completely. What remained was a man whose desperation had finally exceeded his ability to contain it. How did you know? He asked Miss Marple, and there was something almost relieved in his voice, as if confession had become inevitable, and he was grateful for its arrival. Observation, Miss Marple replied. Small things, mostly. The way you deferred to Lord Ashworth, even when his decisions were obviously unwise. The way you seemed almost protective of the financial records. And the way you reacted to the revelation of Lord Ashworth's illness, not with shock, but with resignation. As if you had known, and had been managing around that knowledge for some time. Edmund nodded slowly, then moved to the window. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at the snowing darkness. I am not merely an estate manager, he finally said. I am Lord Ashworth's illegitimate son. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Patricia gasped. Sebastian's face had gone a peculiar shade of grey. Even Lord Ashworth seemed momentarily at a loss for words. "Is this true?" Lord Ashworth demanded, though his voice carried a note of weary resignation rather than shock. "Entirely true," Edmund replied. "My mother was one of the housemaids at Thornfield Manor. She became pregnant with me 48 years ago." Lord Ashworth did the honourable thing as he saw it. He paid for my birth, for my education, for my entry into respectable society as an estate manager. But he could never acknowledge me. The scandal would have been unthinkable for a man of his position. "I see," Lord Ashworth said quietly. "And I suppose you believed that because of this arrangement, you would eventually inherit the estate." "Not believed," Edmund replied. "It was promised. You promised me, sir. You said that though you could not acknowledge me openly during your lifetime, your will would ensure that I was provided for, that the estate would eventually come to me." "And now?" Sylvia asked softly. "Now that he intends to leave the estate, or at least a portion of it, to me. Now I find myself in the position of someone who has sacrificed 30 years of his life, my entire adult existence, for a promise that is being unmade as I watch," Edmund said bitterly. "Gave up the possibility of marriage, of a family of my own, of a legitimate place in society, all based on the understanding that one day the sacrifice would be compensated." "And so you enlisted David Crane," Miss Marple said, understanding now the final piece of the puzzle. "You contacted him, informed him of Lord Ashworth's presence in the hotel, and asked him to create a disturbance. Not to harm anyone, but to divert attention. To prevent the will from being revised before you had a chance to what? To change Lord Ashworth's mind?" "To make him understand," Edmund said, his voice taking on a passionate edge. "To make him see what he was throwing away, the loyalty, the years of service, the sacrifice. But you couldn't just speak to him plainly," Miss Marple continued, "because you knew that plainness would not work. You knew that he would simply refuse to listen. So, instead, you engineered a crisis. You arranged for a woman, hired, I suspect, from one of the London theatrical agencies, to be present in David Crane's room. You arranged for her to scream, to create the impression of violence and danger. And in the chaos that followed, you hoped to have the opportunity to convince Lord Ashworth to reconsider his plans." "Yes," Edmund admitted. "The woman was a friend of David Crane's, someone he had met in London. She was supposed to create the disturbance and then depart the hotel through the normal corridors. She was not supposed to push him out the window. That was not part of the plan." "And yet someone did push him," Miss Marple said, "which suggests that the disturbance took on a life of its own, that someone present in that room had their own reasons for wishing to do him harm. It was at this moment that the door to the inner room opened, and David Crane himself appeared, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch, his face pale from pain and blood loss, but his eyes sharp with understanding. "It was the woman," he said flatly. "The one Edmund hired. She wasn't what she claimed to be. She wasn't an actress. She was something far more dangerous." "What do you mean?" Edmund asked, his face showing confusion, and something that might have been fear. "I mean," David said, "that the woman in the room was Cordelia Vane." The revelation seemed to suck the air out of the room. All eyes turned to Cordelia, who had been standing silently by the window throughout the proceedings. "That's impossible," Patricia said. "Miss Vane has been in Thornfield all evening. She was at the dinner." "Before the dinner, yes," Cordelia said calmly, and her voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. "I went to the hotel early, before the dinner service began. I was meant to join Lord Ashworth and the others at 8 o'clock. but I confess I wished to be present when Mr. Crane arrived. You see, Mr. Travers made the mistake of confiding in me about his arrangement with Mr. Crane. He believed I would support his cause, believed that I would understand his desperation. And in a way, I did understand, not his desperation, but his method. You used him, Edmund said, realization dawning on his face. You used his plan for your own purposes. I did, Cordelia agreed. I paid off Edmund's theatrical actress and took her place. I waited for Mr. Crane to arrive, and when he did, I helped him understand what it means to stand in the way of someone's life. You pushed him out the window, Miss Marple said quietly. I did, Cordelia said, and she did not look away. Not to kill him, necessarily, though I will confess that I did not particularly care whether he lived or died. I pushed him out the window because he represented a threat to everything I had built, everything I had sacrificed for, everything I had endured. Cordelia, Lord Ashworth began. No, she said sharply. Let me finish. You have no idea what it is to be a woman of my age, Lord Ashworth, to have spent one's life in service, to have accepted the gratitude that masquerades as love, to have allowed oneself to hope that eventually duty would transform into something real, and then to have that hope snatched away by a woman who simply walks back into the village with a pretty face and a sad story. Cordelia, Lord Ashworth said again, and his voice carried genuine pain. I never gave you reason to hope for anything beyond what we had. I never promised you. You promised through your silence, Cordelia replied, through 30 years of silence, through the way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't watching, through the small kindnesses and the occasional moments of warmth that went beyond simple gratitude. You promised all of that, and I accepted the promise because it was all you had to give. Miss Marple moved forward slightly, her walking stick tapping softly against the floor. And when you discovered that Lord Ashworth intended to leave you something in his will, not the estate, but money perhaps, some recognition of your service, and then learned that this gift was to be superseded by a gift to Sylvia Crane, you could not bear it, Miss Marple said. The injustice of it, after everything. The insult of being replaced. The despair of realizing that your life had been spent in service to a man who could never truly see you. Cordelia said nothing, but her silence was confirmation enough. So when Mr. Travers presented his plan, a way to disrupt, to create chaos, to force Lord Ashworth to confront the reality of his mortality and his legacy, you saw an opportunity, Miss Marple continued. Not to help Mr. Travers, but to strike at Mr. Crane, to remove the symbol of your displacement, to assert, in the only way left to you, that you mattered. I did matter, Cordelia said, and there were tears in her eyes now, though her face remained rigid with control. For 30 years, I mattered. The room had fallen into a terrible silence. It was Dr. Harrogate who broke it, his medical pragmatism asserting itself over the emotional complexity of the moment. We should call the police, he said quietly. Attempted murder is a serious crime, regardless of the circumstances. Yes, Lord Ashworth agreed, his voice hollow. We should call the police. But it was Miss Marple who held up a hand. Before we do that, she said, I think there is one more matter that requires examination, because I have been thinking, and something about this evening still does not quite resolve itself. Something about the way the events unfolded, and the particular sequence of revelations. What could possibly matter now? Edmund asked, his voice showing the strain of a man whose careful construction of a life has just been dismantled. What matters, Miss Marple said, is the question of who knew what, and when they knew it. I have been thinking about the will that Lord Ashworth mentioned, the will that disinherits Sebastian, The will that provides for Sylvia Crane. And I have been wondering, is that will actually written? Or is it something that Lord Ashworth intends to write? Something that is still merely in the planning stage? Lord Ashworth looked at her with something approaching wonder. You are quite remarkable, Miss Marple. No, the will has not yet been written. I mentioned it during dinner, but the actual legal process has not been completed. I was planning to speak with my solicitor after Christmas. Ah, Miss Marple said, that is important, I think, because it means that Sebastian, who is technically still your heir, had every reason to believe that your remarks at dinner represented a serious threat to his position. So what? Sebastian demanded. I'm not responsible for what happened between Cordelia and David Crane. No, Miss Marple agreed, but you are responsible for what happened between you and Edmund Trevors. You see, I have been wondering about the theatrical actress that Edmund supposedly hired, the one who was supposed to be present in David Crane's room, and I have been wondering how, exactly, Edmund thought he would be able to convince Lord Ashworth to change his mind. Edmund had gone very pale. I don't know what you're implying. I am implying, Miss Marple said, that you did not plan this disturbance alone, that someone else was involved, someone who had their own reasons for wishing to prevent Lord Ashworth from finalizing his will, someone who stood to benefit quite substantially from such prevention. All eyes turned to Sebastian. That's ridiculous, he said immediately. I had nothing to do with any of this. Didn't you? Miss Marple asked gently. You see, Edmund Trevors would never have conceived of this plan on his own. It is too elaborate, too theatrical. Edmund is a practical man. He manages estates, keeps accounts, maintains order. This plan required someone with imagination, someone with charm, someone with the ability to persuade a working-class man to undertake a dangerous scheme in exchange for money. I didn't, Sebastian began. You offered him money, didn't you? Miss Marple continued. You told him that if he could create a disturbance, if he could force Lord Ashworth into a state of emotional crisis, then you would convince your uncle to withdraw the threat of disinheritance. You made him believe that you had the power and the inclination to protect his interests. That's not what happened, Edmund said, but his voice was uncertain. Isn't it? Miss Marple asked. When did you first contact Mr. David Crane, Mr. Trevors? And who gave you the address where he was staying in London? Edmund's silence was answer enough. Sebastian provided the address, Miss Marple said, because he knew that David Crane had reasons of his own to wish to disrupt this evening. Sebastian knew about the will. He knew that Lord Ashworth had decided to provide for Sylvia Crane. He knew that this was unfair, unwise, and potentially devastating to the family fortune. And so he found a way to use that knowledge. He manipulated Edmund. He arranged for David Crane's arrival. He set in motion a series of events that he believed would force Lord Ashworth to reconsider. But I didn't know that Cordelia would, Sebastian said. No, Miss Marple agreed. You didn't know that Cordelia would use Edmund's plan for her own purposes. That is the thing about manipulation, you see. It is a tool that can be picked up and wielded by anyone. Once you set it in motion, you lose control of it. It becomes unpredictable. Sebastian had gone very white. He looked as if he might be sick. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. And yet people have been hurt, Miss Marple replied. David Crane has been physically injured. Cordelia Vane has committed a crime. Edmund Trevors has had his life's hope destroyed. And Lord Ashworth has been forced to confront the reality that neither his love nor his loyalty has been returned with equivalent devotion from those around him. So what happens now? Patricia asked. To all of them? Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment, her pale blue eyes moving from face to face, calculating, weighing, considering. That, she said finally, is a question that requires considerable thought. The morning after the Christmas dinner that had been so thoroughly interrupted by crisis and confession arrived with surprising gentleness. The snow had stopped falling during the night, and Thornfield lay beneath a blanket of white that obscured, for the moment, all the complexities and difficulties of its human inhabitants. Church bells rang out across the village, calling the faithful to Christmas Eve services. The world seemed determined to proceed as if nothing significant had occurred. And yet, in the sitting room of the police station in the neighbouring town of Edwardstone, a very different story was unfolding. Inspector Graves, a man of 55 with the weathered face of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with human nature in its less agreeable manifestations, was examining his notes with evident frustration. Before him sat a complicated situation that defied easy categorization, and Graves was, above all else, a man who preferred things to be categorized clearly and efficiently. So let me understand this, he said, addressing the assembly before him. Lord Ashworth sat in a leather chair, still maintaining an air of dignity despite the circumstances. Cordelia Vane occupied a wooden chair with her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Edmund Trevors and Sebastian Ashworth sat apart from each other, their separation eloquent of the broken alliance between them. Miss Marple occupied a corner chair, having been requested to attend on account of her role in unravelling the evening's events. David Crane was represented by his written statement. As his injuries prevented his physical presence, though Dr. Harrogate had provided medical documentation of the extent of his injuries and the probable cause of them. We have a conspiracy to create a disturbance at a public hotel, Inspector Graves continued, consulting his notes. We have attempted murder. We have manipulation and coercion. We have the revelation of an illegitimate relationship and a broken promise regarding inheritance. And we have the complicating factor that the person who committed the attempted murder, Miss Vane, was motivated primarily by emotional distress rather than financial gain. Is that accurate? Substantially, yes, Miss Marple confirmed. Though I would add that the attempted murder was not premeditated in the legal sense. It was an act of desperation committed in the heat of emotional distress. Attempted murder is attempted murder, Graves said flatly. The law does not typically provide exemptions for crimes of passion. No, Miss Marple agreed. And yet, the law is written by humans for humans, and humans are rarely as simple as the law assumes them to be. Graves looked at her with something that might have been respect, and might have been exasperation. I'm aware of that, Miss Marple, which is why I am troubled. This case would be straightforward were it merely a matter of criminal action. Miss Vane assaulted Mr. Crane and threw him from a window with the clear intention of causing him serious harm. The charges, the trial, the inevitable conviction, all of that is perfectly clear. But the circumstance that brought about her desperation, the manipulation that led her to act with violence, that is far more complex. May I speak? Cordelia asked, and her voice was quiet but steady. Graves nodded, and Cordelia leaned forward slightly. I have no wish to escape justice, she said. I have committed a crime, and I understand that crimes must be punished. But I would ask that the court, when this matter comes before it, understand the context in which the crime was committed. I would ask that the law consider not merely the action, but the accumulation of actions, the small betrayals, the unmet expectations, the slow erosion of hope that led to that moment on the hotel room floor. "Your request is noted," Graves said, his tone softening slightly. "But the law, Miss Vane, is designed to be applied consistently. We cannot create one set of standards for crimes committed out of passion and another for crimes committed out of malice." "Can we not?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I would have thought that we have been doing precisely that for centuries." That is, after all, the distinction between murder and manslaughter. The distinction between premeditation and passion. The law itself acknowledges that motivation matters. "True," Graves admitted, "but the distinction between murder and manslaughter does not excuse the act entirely. There must still be consequence." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "Consequence is unavoidable. It is built into the fabric of existence itself, but there is consequence, and there is consequence. Some consequences are lighter than others. Some consequences carry the possibility of redemption." She paused, and her pale blue eyes moved to Sebastian Ashworth. "What strikes me as particularly complex in this case," she continued, "is the question of differing degrees of culpability. We have Miss Vane, who was driven to violence by emotional distress. We have Mr. Trevors, who was manipulated into arranging a disturbance in hopes of protecting his interests. We have Mr. Sebastian Ashworth, who orchestrated the entire sequence of events. And we have Lord Ashworth himself, who, though he bears no criminal responsibility, bears considerable responsibility for the human suffering that has resulted." Lord Ashworth shifted in his chair but said nothing. "And yet," Miss Marple said, "if we arrest them all, charge them all, punish them all equally, what do we accomplish? We certainly accomplish justice in a formal sense. The law is satisfied. The community sees that crimes have consequences. But have we actually achieved justice in any deeper sense? Have we addressed the root causes of the harm? Have we ensured that similar harms will not occur in the future?" "You're suggesting leniency," Graves said, and his tone made clear his skepticism. "I am suggesting thought," Miss Marple replied. "I am suggesting that before we act, we consider carefully what we are acting toward. Are we seeking punishment, or are we seeking a kind of restoration, a return to balance?" There was a long silence. It was Edmund Trevors who broke it, his voice carrying the tone of a man who has been contemplating these questions through a sleepless night. "I will not testify against Mr. Ashworth," he said. "Whatever my feelings about how I was manipulated, whatever my sense of betrayal, I will not provide evidence that would result in his prosecution." "Your reluctance to testify does not prevent prosecution," Graves pointed out. "I am perfectly capable of pursuing charges based on the evidence available." "I understand," Edmund said, "but I am telling you that you will do so without my cooperation. And I believe you will find that others, Lord Ashworth perhaps, will also decline to cooperate fully with the prosecution." It was true, Miss Marple realized. The witnesses in this case all had reasons of their own to deflect from complete honesty. Lord Ashworth would be unwilling to publicly acknowledge his illegitimate son. Sebastian would be unable to claim that his manipulation was anything other than deliberate. Even Cordelia would be inclined to describe events in a way that might generate sympathy. "This is highly irregular," Graves said, his frustration evident. "Human behavior generally is," Miss Marple replied, "which is precisely why the law, written as it is in terms of abstract principles, often fails to address the actual complexity of human situations. Are you suggesting that I simply allow these crimes to go unpunished? Graves demanded. I am suggesting, Miss Marple said carefully, that there are forms of punishment that exist outside of the legal system, that there are consequences that operate according to their own logic, and that sometimes the most effective justice is the justice that naturally arises from the human consequences of one's actions. Graves was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at each of the people present, at Cordelia's resigned acceptance, at Edmund's shame, at Sebastian's barely concealed panic, at Lord Ashworth's weariness. I will need to speak with the Chief Constable, Graves said finally, and with the Crown Prosecutor, but I will confess that this case presents complexities that make me wish to consult more widely than I might otherwise do. He turned to Miss Marple. You seem to have thoughts about how this should be resolved. What do you suggest? Miss Marple took a moment to organize her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was precise and measured. I would suggest, she said, that Miss Vane be charged with assault, but that the charge of attempted murder be reconsidered. That Mr. Crane's injuries, while serious, do not suggest that Miss Vane intended his death, only his incapacity. That Mr. Trevors's role be understood as primarily manipulated rather than primarily criminal. He was used as a tool by Mr. Ashworth. That Mr. Ashworth face consequences, though these need not be exclusively legal. And that Lord Ashworth face his own consequences, which I believe he already has. What consequences are those? Graves asked, his skepticism evident. The recognition, Miss Marple said quietly, that his attempt to avoid the messy realities of human emotion, his attempt to live in a world of proprieties and duties and clearly defined roles, has resulted in considerable suffering, for himself and for those around him. I suspect he will find that consequence quite sufficient. Lord Ashworth looked at her, and in his eyes Miss Marple saw confirmation that she had understood his particular torment quite accurately. I will consider your suggestions, Graves said, but I will warn you all that the law moves according to its own schedule, and there are certain matters that cannot simply be dismissed or reframed in the interests of a kind of natural justice. I understand, Miss Marple said. The law must do what the law does, but I trust that in doing so, it will do so with mercy. It was on Christmas morning, as snow fell softly once more on the village of Thornfield, that Miss Marple received a visitor. It was Lord Ashworth, and he appeared at her cottage door with the appearance of a man who had come to make some final accounting with existence. She received him in her sitting room, where a small fire crackled in the grate, and her knitting lay across an armchair, a scarf half finished in soft grey wool. I wanted to thank you, Lord Ashworth said, accepting her offer of tea with the automatic politeness of a man whose manners would survive even the complete dissolution of his circumstances. For what you did, for what you are still doing, I suspect. I have merely observed, Miss Marple replied, settling herself into her chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints had seen many Christmases. Observation, at my age, is practically a profession. You did more than observe, Ashworth said. You understood. You understood what happened, and more importantly, you understood why it happened. I understood, Miss Marple corrected gently, that human behavior follows patterns that are remarkably consistent across all levels of society. Whether one is a duke or a dustman, one's responses to loss, to fear, to the prospect of one's own mortality, these responses are essentially similar. What varies is merely the setting and the particular circumstances. You are saying, Ashworth said slowly, that what Cordelia felt, what Edmund felt, what Sebastian was, moved to do, all of this was foreseeable, inevitable even? I would not use the word inevitable, Miss Marple said. Too much of human life depends on choice, on the moments when someone decides to do one thing rather than another. But I would say that the patterns were clear to anyone observant enough to see them. And I failed to see them, Ashworth said. It was a statement of fact, not a question. You failed to look for them, Miss Marple replied. You were too occupied with the surface of things, with propriety, with honor, with the maintenance of a certain kind of public persona. You did not wish to see the suffering beneath the surface, because to see it would have required you to acknowledge responsibility for it. Ashworth was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I have decided to do something. I wanted your blessing, though I am aware you may not believe I am entitled to ask for it. Tell me, Miss Marple said. I have contacted my solicitor, Ashworth said. Having my will revised. The estate will indeed pass to Edmund, but I am also establishing a trust for Cordelia, an amount sufficient to provide her with security for the rest of her life. And I am setting aside funds for Sylvia Crane, though not as a condition of marriage or any other arrangement, simply as a gift, given freely, with no expectation of anything in return. That is good, Miss Marple said. Though it does not, I should mention, alter the fact that Mr. Trevors's life has been disrupted. Miss Vane's freedom has been compromised, and Mrs. Crane will forever carry the knowledge that your attentions to her were informed by factors other than simple affection. I am aware of that, Ashworth said. The question is, do you believe that what I am attempting to do represents some kind of meaningful attempt at redemption? Or is it merely the gesture of a guilty conscience? Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. I believe, she said, that the distinction between genuine redemption and the gesture of a guilty conscience is often difficult to determine in the moment. What matters is the consistency of one's actions over time. If you persist in these actions, if you genuinely attempt to make what amends you can, then perhaps you will eventually find yourself transformed by the attempt. But if these gestures are merely a momentary salve for your conscience, then they will mean very little. That is a cold answer, Ashworth said. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, but it is honest, and honesty, I have found, is far more valuable than comfort. Ashworth rose to depart, but before he did, he turned back to Miss Marple. One more thing, he said. I wanted to ask, in your observation of human nature, in your study of how people behave when confronted with loss and betrayal, do you believe that Cordelia will be able to bear her punishment? Do you believe that she will be able to maintain her dignity through the trial? And whatever comes after? Miss Marple considered the question with great care. I believe, she said finally, that Cordelia will do what she has done for 30 years. She will endure. She will maintain her composure. She will live with her regrets and her choices. Whether she will find peace, that is another question entirely. That depends on matters far beyond my capacity to influence or predict. A fair answer, Ashworth said, and there was something almost like respect in his voice as he left. By the time Easter came to Thornfield, the events of Christmas had taken on the quality of village legend. The truth, as is always the case, had been simplified and distorted in the retelling. In some versions, it was a tale of a spurned lover's passion. In others, It was a story of family betrayal and financial conspiracy. In still others, it had become something almost mythological, a cautionary tale about the wages of pride and the consequences of attempting to manipulate the hearts of others. The actual reality was considerably more complex and considerably less satisfying to those who preferred their moral lessons delivered with clarity and finality. Cordelia Vane had been tried and convicted of assault. The charge of attempted murder had been dropped, in part due to the persuasive advocacy of her legal representation, in part due to the reluctance of Lord Ashworth and others to provide testimony that would result in a harsher sentence. She had been sentenced to 2 years in a women's prison, a sentence that would have seemed light to some and severe to others depending entirely on one's perspective, regarding female violence and emotional distress as mitigating factors. Edmund Trevors had not been prosecuted, largely due to the difficulty of proving that his actions constituted criminal conspiracy rather than mere foolishness. He remained as estate manager, though the terms of his employment had been substantially revised. Lord Ashworth had settled a sum on him sufficient to compensate, in some measure, for the betrayal of his expectations. Whether Edmund would eventually inherit the estate remained a matter that would be decided by Lord Ashworth's death, which everyone, including Ashworth himself, understood to be approaching more rapidly than he had previously suggested. Sebastian Ashworth had left England. He had departed for South America on a ship bound for Buenos Aires, leaving behind letters that expressed apology and a hope for eventual forgiveness. Whether he would ever return to Thornfield remained doubtful. The village, for the most part, was relieved to see him gone. His complicity in the evening's events had been sufficient to destroy his social standing entirely, and there was general agreement that he was better situated attempting to make a fresh life in a place where his antecedents were unknown. David Crane had recovered from his injuries, though he bore a permanent slight limp and complained frequently about pain in his ribs during cold weather. He had reconciled with his ex-wife, though the reconciliation was more in the nature of an understanding between two people who had once loved each other, and might again some day, if circumstances permitted. For the moment, he remained in Thornfield, ostensibly to assist Sylvia in managing the small fortune that Lord Ashworth had settled upon her. Sylvia herself had become something of an anomaly in Thornfield society. The knowledge that she had been the subject of Lord Ashworth's romantic inclination, combined with the knowledge that she would eventually inherit a substantial sum, had elevated her status considerably. Yet there remained an undertone of scandal, a sense that she had benefited from disruption and death, even if she had not engineered such benefit. She bore this with grace, though Miss Marple observed that she had become somewhat more withdrawn, as if the attentions paid to her had left her wary of human connection. As for Lord Ashworth himself, he had not died, not yet. But he had begun, in the months following Christmas, a kind of systematic withdrawal from the world. He spent increasing amounts of time in his gardens, maintaining his roses with a care that bordered on obsession. He had become a different man from the one who had hosted that terrible Christmas dinner. Quieter, more introspective, less inclined toward the imperious assertions of authority that had once characterized him. Miss Marple had seen him occasionally in the village, and had been struck by the way his eyes seemed to focus on things that no one else could see. She suspected he was seeing not the present reality of Thornfield, but rather the various paths that his life might have taken had he made different choices at critical moments. It was in early April on a day when the spring flowers were beginning to emerge from the cold ground, that Miss Marple received a final visit from Cordelia Vane. She had been released early. Her behaviour in prison had been exemplary, and there had been letters attesting to her character from respected members of the village. She was thinner than she had been before, and her face had taken on a more austere quality, as if the experience of imprisonment had stripped away something essential, and left only the core. "I wanted to thank you," Cordelia said, sitting in Miss Marple's sitting room in the same chair where Lord Ashworth had sat months before. "For what?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew. "For understanding," Cordelia replied, "for seeing what I had done, and still seeing me as a human being rather than merely as a criminal. Your testimony at my trial, it could have been worse. You could have portrayed me as entirely mad, entirely consumed by rage, but you didn't. You explained. You made the court understand. I told the truth," Miss Marple said simply, "that you had acted out of desperation and pain, not out of a fundamental evil. Whether the court made use of that truth is not my concern." "But you made a difference," Cordelia said, "a difference in how I was perceived, and therefore in how I was treated. I'm aware of that." "What will you do now?" Miss Marple asked. "I have been thinking about that," Cordelia replied. "Lord Ashworth has offered me a pension, a generous one. He has also suggested that I might wish to travel, to see something of the world beyond Thornfield. I think I may take him up on that suggestion. I think I may go to Italy. I have always wanted to see Italy." "That sounds wise," Miss Marple said. "Do you think," Cordelia asked, "that I will ever be able to forget what I did? That I will ever be able to move beyond it?" "No," Miss Marple said, and her directness was kind. "I do not believe that. But I believe that you may eventually come to understand your actions in a different way. Not as the defining moment of your life, but as a moment, an important moment certainly, but still merely one moment among many. And that, understanding, when it comes, may bring something that resembles peace." Cordelia rose to leave, but before she did, she said something that seemed to have cost her considerable effort. "I was wrong," she said, "about Sylvia Crane, about my expectations, about what I believed I was entitled to because of my service. I see that now. I was wrong." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "You were wrong, but being wrong is not a permanent condition. It is a moment of understanding, and what one does with that understanding determines whether one grows or diminishes from the experience." After Cordelia had gone, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm, creating something out of nothing but wool and patience. The mysteries of Christmas had been largely resolved. The crimes had been prosecuted or not, as the case might be. The family secrets had been aired and confronted. The social structures of Thornfield had shifted and adjusted, incorporating the knowledge of what had occurred beneath the surface of propriety. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, the deepest mysteries remained mysteries. Why humans behaved as they did. Why they deceived themselves about their own motivations. Why they believed that love could be purchased with security, or loyalty rewarded with affection. Why they expected the world to be ordered according to principles, when in fact it operated according to something far more complicated and unpredictable. These were mysteries that no amount of observation could fully illuminate. These were mysteries that each human being would have to contemplate and negotiate according to their own understanding. All she could do was observe, and occasionally, when the opportunity presented itself, to point out the patterns that others had failed to see. The spring flowers continued to bloom in Thornfield, indifferent to human suffering and human joy alike. And Miss Marple, 83 years old and still sharp-eyed, continued her slow progress through the village, observing, noting, understanding the subtle semaphore through which human beings communicated their secrets to those patient enough to listen. 3 weeks after Cordelia Vane's release from prison, a letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. It was from Lord Ashworth's solicitor, requesting her presence at the solicitor's office in the neighbouring town of Edwardstone. The letter did not specify the reason for this summons, but Miss Marple, who had made something of a study of human nature, understood immediately what was likely occurring. Lord Ashworth was dying. This was not a diagnosis that anyone had formally announced, but the village had been whispering about it for weeks. He had become increasingly frail, his movements more deliberate, his appearances in public fewer and farther between. The roses in his garden were blooming beautifully this spring, but Lord Ashworth had not been observed tending them with his usual obsessive care. The solicitor's office was on the High Street, in a building that had housed legal enterprises for more than a century. The solicitor himself, Mr. Denham, was a man of 70, precise and formal in manner, with the kind of discretion that suggested decades of handling matters that required absolute confidence. "Miss Marple," he said, greeting her with a respectful bow. "Thank you for coming. I have received instructions from Lord Ashworth that you should be informed of certain matters relating to his estate and his wishes. Please sit." Miss Marple settled herself in the chair he indicated, her walking stick leaning against the armrest. "Lord Ashworth has revised his will," Mr. Denham continued. "He has also written a series of documents that he wishes to be made public after his death, which he believes will occur within the next 6 months, perhaps sooner." "What is the nature of these documents?" Miss Marple asked. "They are, in essence, a kind of confession," Mr. Denham replied. "A detailed account of the events that occurred around Christmas, but with a substantial difference from what was previously revealed. Lord Ashworth is providing information that will clarify certain matters and, he believes, correct certain misunderstandings about who was primarily responsible for the actions that were taken." "What misunderstandings?" Miss Marple asked, though her tone suggested that she was not entirely surprised by this development. "The misunderstanding regarding Sebastian Ashworth's degree of culpability," Mr. Denham said. "According to Lord Ashworth's new account, Sebastian's involvement in the evening's events was less extensive than was previously suggested. In fact, according to this account, Sebastian was manipulated by someone else, someone whose role in orchestrating events has not yet been fully revealed." Miss Marple was very still. "Who?" she asked. "Lord Ashworth is not willing to name that person directly," Mr. Denham replied, "but he is providing sufficient details that the identity could be determined by someone sufficiently familiar with the events and the people involved." "Someone, Lord Ashworth suggests, like yourself." "I see," Miss Marple said, though her expression suggested that she saw far more than had been explicitly stated. "There is more," Mr. Denham continued. "Lord Ashworth has also made a series of financial arrangements. A substantial sum has been settled on Miss Cordelia Vane, beyond what was previously provided. Additional monies have been designated for Edmund Trevors, and a separate fund has been established in the name of David Crane to compensate him for his injuries." "He is attempting to purchase absolution," Miss Marple observed, though not unkindly. He is attempting, Mr. Denham corrected gently, to take responsibility for the consequences of his actions and inactions. He understands that money cannot undo harm, but he believes it may go some small way toward compensating for it. What does he expect me to do with this information? Miss Marple asked. He expects, Mr. Denham said, that you will eventually understand who was truly responsible for the events of Christmas. And he trusts that you will decide, according to your own judgment, what should be done with that knowledge. After leaving the solicitor's office, Miss Marple walked slowly through the village, her mind working through the implications of what she had been told. The snow of Christmas seemed impossibly distant, though it was only a few months past. Spring was in full bloom now. The world had turned green again, and the village had largely moved on to other concerns. But the question of who had truly orchestrated the events of Christmas remained. Miss Marple had believed that she had understood the truth, that Sebastian had manipulated Edmund into attempting to create a disturbance, that Cordelia had used that disturbance for her own purposes, and that the entire evening had been set in motion by a combination of factors that had resulted in David Crane's assault. But now, Lord Ashworth was suggesting that her understanding had been incomplete, that there was someone else, someone whose role in orchestrating the evening's events had been central, but whose identity had been obscured by the focus on Cordelia and Sebastian and Edmund. As she walked through the village, past the church where the bells were ringing for evensong, past the shops where village women were conducting their ordinary business, Miss Marple's mind began to work through the possibilities with methodical precision. Who would have known about Lord Ashworth's intentions regarding his will? Who would have had reason to wish to disrupt the evening's revelations? Who would have possessed the intelligence and sophistication to orchestrate a disturbance that would draw attention away from what was occurring in the dining room? The answer, when it came to Miss Marple, seemed so obvious that she was astonished that she had not seen it immediately. It had been Dr. Harrogate. Dr. Harrogate, the village physician, who had known about Lord Ashworth's declining health, who had known about the will, who had admitted to Miss Marple that he was troubled by the evening. Dr. Harrogate, who had been present at the dinner, and who had, in fact, suggested to Lord Ashworth that he might wish to reconsider his plans regarding Sylvia Crane. But why would Dr. Harrogate have orchestrated a disturbance? What would he have to gain? The answer came to Miss Marple as she reached her garden gate and paused to observe the new growth emerging from the earth. Mrs. Margaret Harrogate had been with her husband, yes, but more significantly, Margaret Harrogate was Sylvia Crane's cousin. They had attended school together as children. Margaret had watched as Sylvia made her unfortunate marriage and suffered her subsequent divorce. Margaret had likely encouraged Sylvia's return to Thornfield and had been one of her closest confidants during her readjustment to village life. Margaret would have known that Lord Ashworth's will would leave money to Sylvia, but Margaret would also have known that such an arrangement would be a source of significant village scandal. She would have known that Sylvia would be the subject of gossip and suspicion, and she would have wished, as one wishes for those one loves, to protect her from that gossip and that suspicion. What if the disturbance had not been intended to prevent Lord Ashworth from finalizing his will? What if it had been intended instead to provide an alternative explanation for the events of the evening? What if the goal had been to create such chaos and confusion that the details of Lord Ashworth's intentions would become obscured by other, more dramatic revelations? If that was the case, then Margaret Harrogate had partially succeeded. The focus of attention had shifted away from the question of whether Sylvia should be the recipient of Lork, Ashworth's generosity, and had instead centred on Cordelia's assault, on Edmund's manipulations, on Sebastian's coercion. But who had Margaret gotten to create the disturbance? The theatrical actress was a theatrical actress, certainly. That much had been confirmed. But who had hired her? Who had provided the money? The answer was almost certainly Dr. Harrogate himself. Margaret's husband, a man of modest means but considerable professional standing and credibility. A man who would have been able to contact theatrical agencies in London without drawing suspicion. A man who would have had access to the hotel's layout and timing. But why would Dr. Harrogate agree to participate in such a scheme? What would motivate him to risk his professional reputation and his legal standing? The answer, Miss Marple understood, was simple. Love. Or rather, affection. The kind of love that a good man feels for his wife when his wife is troubled and anxious. The kind of love that moves a man to action in service of someone else's peace of mind. Margaret Harrogate had been anxious about her cousin's position in village society. Dr. Harrogate, observing his wife's anxiety, had done what many men do. He had attempted to solve the problem, not by addressing it directly, but by creating a distraction that would deflect attention away from it. The irony, of course, was that his solution had made matters considerably worse. The disturbance he had orchestrated had been seized upon by Cordelia, who had used it as cover for her attempted murder. The disturbance had resulted in David Crane's injuries and Cordelia's imprisonment. The disturbance had, in essence, transformed what might have been a straightforward matter of village gossip into a criminal case with far-reaching consequences. Miss Marple stood in her garden, the spring flowers blooming around her, and considered what she should do with this knowledge. She could go to the police. She could demand that Dr. Harrogate be prosecuted for his role in orchestrating the disturbance. She could ensure that he faced consequences for his actions, however well-intentioned those actions had been. Or she could, as Lord Ashworth had suggested, use her judgment regarding what should be done with this knowledge. It was at this moment that she heard a voice from beyond her garden gate. "Miss Marple?" She turned to see Margaret Harrogate standing on the path, looking very much as she had looked before Christmas, cheerful, warmth radiating from her like heat from a stove. "Margaret," Miss Marple said, recognizing that this was not a chance encounter. "How lovely to see you. Would you care to come in for tea?" Margaret accepted the invitation, and soon they were seated in Miss Marple's sitting room, cups of tea steaming gently between them. "I wanted to speak with you," Margaret said without preamble. "I received word that you had visited Mr. Denham, the solicitor. I suspected that you might have learned something about what happened at Christmas." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "I believe I have." "And?" Margaret asked, her voice very quiet. "And I believe," Miss Marple said slowly, "that a good woman, motivated by love for her cousin, conspired with her husband to create a disturbance that was intended to protect that cousin from village gossip. I believe that disturbance was seized upon by someone else, Miss Cordelia Vane, and used as cover for an act of violence. I believe that Dr. Harrogate and you are responsible indirectly for the consequences that followed from that act of violence." Margaret's face had gone very white. Her teacup rattled against the saucer as her hands shook. "We didn't know," she whispered. "We didn't know that Cordelia would... We didn't know that anyone would be hurt. We only wanted to create a distraction. a confusion, something that would shift the focus away from Sylvia and her relationship with Lord Ashworth. "I understand," Miss Marple said, and her voice was not unkind. "Good intentions, poor execution, and unforeseen consequences. That is the story of much human suffering, I have found." "What will you do?" Margaret asked, looking up at Miss Marple with desperate eyes. "Will you tell the police?" "No," Miss Marple said. "I will not tell the police. Lord Ashworth has suggested that I use my judgment regarding this matter, and my judgment is that additional prosecutions would serve no useful purpose. Cordelia has been imprisoned. David Crane has been compensated. The village has learned its lessons about the dangers of attempting to manipulate others' lives." "But we committed a crime," Margaret said. "We orchestrated." "You committed a crime, yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But the consequences of that crime have fallen far more heavily on others than they would fall on you. Your prosecution would not restore David Crane's full health. It would not give Cordelia back her years of freedom. It would only add more suffering to a situation that has already generated far too much suffering." "How can you be so forgiving?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking. "After everything that has happened?" "I am not forgiving," Miss Marple said. "Forgiveness is not my function. But I am recognizing that human beings are rarely simply good or simply bad. You are a woman who loves your cousin, and was willing to do something foolish in service of that love. You and your husband will have to live with the knowledge that your actions had consequences you did not intend. You will have to bear the weight of that knowledge. That, I think, is punishment enough. Will you tell Sylvia? Will you tell her that we—" "That is your decision," Miss Marple said. "I will not tell her. But you may wish to consider whether she deserves to know the truth about what was attempted in her behalf." The spring turned to summer, and Lord Ashworth's health declined with the approach of autumn. By August, it was clear that the end was approaching. The roses in his garden continued to bloom, though their beauty seemed almost mocking now, an indictment of the futility of aesthetic cultivation when faced with the reality of mortality. Miss Marple did not see Lord Ashworth again before his death, but she received from his solicitor a final message, a simple note written in a shaky hand that bore the evidence of his physical decline. "You understood," it read. "You understood what had occurred, and you chose mercy over justice. I hope you will forgive me for being unable to do the same. I have written the truth, and it will be published after my death, along with the stipulation that those named in it shall face whatever consequences society deems appropriate." He died on the 15th of September, peacefully, in his sleep. The village mourned him in the way that villages mourn the passing of long-established figures, with genuine sadness mixed with the practical considerations of succession and the disposition of property. When his will was read, Edmund Trevors inherited the estate. When his final letters and documents were published, the village learned of Dr. Harrowgate's and Margaret's involvement in orchestrating the Christmas disturbance. The revelation created something of a scandal. Dr. Harrowgate faced calls for his removal from the village's medical practice. Margaret, who had been universally beloved, found herself the subject of whispers and judgment. But Miss Marple observed that the village, once it had accepted the reality of their actions, began a slow process of reintegration. By autumn, by the time the leaves had turned and fallen, the doctor was still practicing medicine in Thornfield, though with somewhat diminished clientele. Margaret had regained some, though not all, of her previous social standing. The business of village life had moved forward, as it always did, incorporating the knowledge of human failing into the fabric of daily existence. Sylvia Crane had learned of the Harrogates' involvement. Miss Marple suspected they had told her themselves and had ultimately forgiven them. Her relationship with Margaret was different now, fraught with complications and the awareness of attempted manipulation, but still functional. She had used much of her inheritance to establish a small charity for women leaving abusive marriages, work that allowed her to transform her personal suffering into something resembling purpose. Sebastian Ashworth sent a letter from Buenos Aires, expressing shock and shame at the revelations about his own involvement in orchestrating the disturbance. He had, it appeared, attempted to build a respectable life in South America, but the knowledge of his past had haunted him sufficiently that he continued to correspond with Miss Marple, as if seeking some form of absolution for his actions. As for Cordelia Vane, she had indeed travelled to Italy, as she had promised. She had sent postcards to Miss Marple from various cities, Rome, Florence, Venice, each card bearing a brief message of appreciation and reflection. She appeared, from the evidence of the cards, to be engaged in the process that Miss Marple had predicted, slowly transforming her understanding of her actions from something that defined her entirely into something that was simply one moment, albeit an important one, in a long life. As the winter of the following year approached, Miss Marple found herself thinking often of the Christmas that had been interrupted by the disturbance at Thornfield House Hotel. It seemed now, looking back across more than a year, like something from a novel, rather than something that had actually occurred. The dramatic revelations, the acts of violence, the transformations of character and circumstance, all of it had the quality of invented narrative. And yet it had been real. The consequences were still unfolding. The effects on those involved would continue to ripple through their lives long after the initial crisis had passed. It was on a cold December afternoon, as Christmas approached once more, that Miss Marple received a final visitor in connection with the events of the previous year. It was Dr. Harrogate, without his wife, and his expression was one of uncomfortable gravity. "I wanted to thank you," he said, once they were settled by her fire. "Margaret and I have discussed this at some length, and we both felt that you should know. Your decision to remain silent about our involvement, your choice to allow us to maintain our positions in the village, it has given us the opportunity to build something better from the wreckage of that evening." "That is good," Miss Marple said, "though I should note that I did not make my choice because I was offering you forgiveness or absolution. I made my choice because I believed that additional punishment would serve no useful purpose." "We understand that," Dr. Harrogate said, "and we are grateful nonetheless. Margaret has become quite involved in Sylvia's charity work. She says that helping women in situations similar to what Sylvia experienced has given her life a purpose she previously lacked. I have also found that I have become more careful in my medical practice, more attentive to the psychological dimensions of health and illness. It is as if the crisis has forced us both to become better people than we were before. People often improve when they are forced to confront the consequences of their actions," Miss Marple observed. "That does not excuse the actions, but it may redeem them, in a sense." After Dr. Harrogate left, Miss Marple sat alone by her fire, her knitting needles in her lap, thinking about the nature of justice and mercy and the thin line that divides them. She had not acted out of a simple desire to forgive. She had acted out of a complex calculation regarding what would produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. She had calculated that additional prosecutions would satisfy the demands of justice, but would damage the entire community. She had calculated that those involved already bore sufficient burden from their knowledge of what they had done. Whether her calculation had been correct, that was something she would never know with certainty. The consequences of one's actions rippled forward in time in ways that could never be fully predicted or measured. But she believed, looking back across the year, that she had done the right thing. As Christmas once more approached, bringing with it that peculiar quality of English provincial life that mixed determined cheerfulness with underlying anxiety, Miss Marple prepared her cottage for the season. She placed holly in the windows. She baked her traditional shortbread. She prepared packages of gifts for those in the village who had no family to provide for them at Christmas. And in her sitting room, as she knitted by the fire, she reflected on the mystery that had begun on Christmas Eve of the previous year, the Christmas dinner with an empty chair. The title, she realized, had been particularly apt. The empty chair was not merely the chair that would have been occupied by Lord Ashworth had he lived to celebrate another Christmas. The empty chair was also the chair that represented absence in a deeper sense. The absence of genuine connection, the absence of true understanding between people, the absence of the capacity to simply see another human being without projecting one's own needs and desires onto them. In solving the mystery, she had not brought about justice in any conventional sense. She had allowed crimes to go unpunished. She had allowed manipulation to escape consequence. She had allowed human weakness to be hidden beneath the surface of ordinary village life, where it would continue to operate, shaping behavior and determining outcomes for those involved. But perhaps that was what the mystery had been teaching all along. That there is no such thing as simple justice, only the complex negotiation between consequences and mercy. That the best we can do is to observe carefully, to understand deeply, and then to act in a way that minimizes suffering while acknowledging the reality of human fallibility. Outside, the snow was falling once more. In the church, the bells rang for evensong, and Miss Marple, 84 years old and still sharp-eyed, continued her slow progress through understanding the mysteries that lay beneath the surface of ordinary village life. The mystery of Christmas had ended, but its echoes would continue to sound through Thornfield for years to come. And the understanding it had generated about love and betrayal, about loyalty and its limits, about the terrible price of expecting others to fit into the spaces that we have carved out for them in our imaginations. That understanding would remain permanent and unchanging, as solid as the stones beneath the village church. The year's turning was complete. The wheel had come round again to Christmas. And in Thornfield, where secrets had been revealed and broken promises had been exposed, the village once more prepared itself to celebrate a season of goodwill and peace, knowing now how much work was required to maintain that peace, and how fragile was the goodwill that held it in place.